We are going to watch a film and follow along with the study guide link in the description below. The film is Hillbilly Elegy. It is J.D. Vance's memoir. It tells about the 2024 Republican vice presidential candidate's life growing up, his family struggle, their culture. And oh, by the way, it's Southern Ohio, so let's embrace it. What are we going to learn? Well, we'll learn about his background. We'll also learn a bit about American culture and how that applies to today. And also, speaking of today, this will help us understand current events like the opioid crisis. So we have this reputation, this image of a hillbilly, and to be quite honest, it's not that far from the truth. Is it exaggerated? Yes. Can it be offensive? Yes. But the culture can be explained, and we're going to trace the roots of that culture and then try to understand some of the implications of today. So we're talking about Appalachian Mountains, the South, Southern Ohio. You see Ohio right there. That red line is I-70. North of I-70 is a completely different state, settled by completely different people. Southern Ohio, much more impoverished, settled by different people outside of the cities. And even though it's not technically the South to most Americans, but those in Ohio probably know, it is basically an extension of Kentucky. And we'll get into that. So we go all the way back to 1400. We've got England, we've got Scotland, we've got Ireland. The English, before they can establish their empire, have to establish their empire at home. So they already own the land in Ireland. They are now trying to get the Scottish to behave. And so the English on the bottom, white and red, are fighting for 200 years with the Scottish, blue and white. Oh, by the way, England owns Ireland, but Ireland doesn't want to be owned by England, so they're fighting there too. So the English got their hands full. So King James I devises a plan. He says, hey, Scottish, tired of fighting you. Here's what we'll do. We'll give you this land over here in Ulster, in Northern Ireland. It's yours. Let's be done with this. So the Scots take him up on it. The Scots move to Ireland. Now they're no longer Scottish. After 100 years, they become immersed in Irish culture and habits and language, and they become the Scots-Irish by 1700. All right, so everything worked out. End of story. Wrong. Now the Irish are fighting with the Scottish, so it's another 100 years of battle, and we've got 300 years of Scots fighting and fighting and fighting. And that's how they became a very rough and tumble people. Really rough. 300 years of fighting, you become some pretty rough dudes. And there's a lot of good history written about this from Scotland and Ireland and eventually America studying the Scots-Irish and how much and how hard they are, how tough. Eventually, it becomes too tough, and we have potato famines, poor harvests, constantly fighting. Eventually, the Scots around the 1700s say, we're peacing out. We're done with this. We're going to America for a new opportunity, a new start. We're tired of this rough and tumble life. Yeah, right. So they arrive in America, and the colonists say, whoa, who are you people? You people are backwards. And you can't really, well, that's just the way it is. 300 years of fighting, sorry. So they're not welcomed. So they move west to the interior, to the Appalachian Mountains. And they show up, and once again, there's people there that really don't want them there. The Cherokee, the Iroquois say, you people are rough. We need you to get out of here. They're not welcomed anywhere. They weren't welcomed in their own land of Scotland. They weren't welcomed in Ireland. They weren't welcomed by the colonists. Now they're again fighting it out in the mountains, guerrilla-style warfare. Eventually, the Scots-Irish will seize the land and start establishing farms and living in the Appalachian Mountains. The rough and tumble people just continue fighting. And the fighting doesn't stop there, because once they've established their lands, the American Revolution comes along and the English come along, and now they're fighting their old pals and the English once again. But this time the Scots-Irish, being mountain people, having lived in the area, basically home field, they're able to defeat the English. And a lot of the battling in the South, especially the Appalachian Mountains, Greensboro area, will lead to the ultimate defeat of the English at Yorktown. So Go Scots-Irish. So what we have here is a people that have been fighting forever, living in harsh areas. The mountains are not forgiving. When they lived in Scotland and Ulster, Ireland, those were not the greatest lands. That's kind of what happens when you're not really liked. You don't get the best land. So they once again are in a hard to inhabit area in the 1700s, in the 1800s. They are able to farm mainly livestock in the mountains. This is not growing corn, and that's going to have a major impact on the development of the Scots-Irish and their culture. This is a different type of farming that farmers in the north may not ever realize is an issue. We'll get to this issue in a second. Now, one of the benefits of being in this harsh land and farming and doing livestock is they had done that before in Scotland and in Ireland. They're well suited for working in this area. Other farmers that might have moved here may have moved from other parts of Europe that aren't used to this type of agriculture. So this is one of the reasons why the Scots-Irish will stay and others will move on. So again, when we look at the background of the Scots-Irish, these people fighting for hundreds of years, right? Again, the Scots-Irish are going to be modern day hillbillies. Like, why are these guys so rough? Why are they always fighting and arguing? Because this is what they've known for the last 600 years. It's their culture. It's in their DNA. Now, going to the livestock issue, you've got these rough and tumble guys that fight all the time. That also connects to their agricultural approach. Say, wait, farmers and fighters, why would a fighter be a good farmer? So going back to the idea of this isn't corn, this isn't cotton, this isn't plantations and rows and acres of fields. Why is that different? Well, in the middle of the night, no one's going to steal all of your corn. In the middle of the night, in Appalachia, in Scotland, in Ireland, someone could walk away with every one of your heads of cattle or whatever it is you're raising. And then you're broke and your life is over. There is a defense that has to take place so that you're not stolen from. You can't be weak. A farmer in most of America doesn't have to worry about theft. A farmer in the mountains raising livestock absolutely does. And so you have these fighting people who are constantly having to watch their back. And a culture of honor develops, not a culture of dignity. You have to prove you're tough so no one steals from you. Someone crosses you, says a bad thing about you, you might have to kill them. This is where we get the Hatfield and the McCoy feuds and Harlan County bloody wars in eastern Kentucky. There are plenty of stories of kinfolk murdering kinfolk, brothers killing brothers, families going to war with each other over the slightest slight, because you have to prove to people that you're tough so they don't try to steal from you. And that culture and that heritage has been around for 500 years. You can't really shake it. So you fast forward today and you see the hillbillies or people from Appalachia or parts of the South that are aggressive at times and get very upset, have hot fuses and tempers. It's in the DNA. When you fight for hundreds of years, when you have to prove to people in the mountains not to steal from you, that culture doesn't disappear. Is it a very productive culture? No, we've seen it's not been the greatest for the advancement of America, although it really helped out in World War II and the various wars where people of Scots-Irish descent were pretty good soldiers. But, you don't necessarily want the Scots-Irish running your HR department. Now, when you have to worry about people always stealing from you, you're fighting all the time. And when you're living a life where you're constantly having to fight and prove that you're tougher than everybody else, you also embrace another style of life, which is they partied hard. They do party hard. They live life on the edge. When you're living close to death, you fight. And then when you party too hard, you fight some more. So again, they were already living on the edge, always close to death. Now you're even closer to death when you're partying and fighting. And that is the Scots-Irish. And that is connected to today's hillbilly culture or redneck culture. It's not very productive. Can we just excuse it because of 500 years? Maybe you can. So going further, when you're living on the edge, every day could be your last. You've been fighting for 500 years. You've been kicked out of everywhere you've ever been. their sorrow, their sadness. And we see a development of music that comes from Scotland and Ireland and all the way over to the Appalachian Mountains. And we get eventually country music, guys like Dwight Yoakam, who we'll talk about in a second, or any of your Nashville stars. But this music develops from a life of sorrow and agony. And you get bluegrass and banjos and fiddles and eventually country music and blues and R&B. All this can really trace its roots, or at least part of its roots, to this Scots-Irish migration and their inability to be accepted by the dominant culture there, their inability to be accepted by the majority. Beyond the music, we'll go back to the culture. They say that when the English arrive in a town, the first thing they build is a church. And when the Germans arrive in a town, the first thing they build is a barn. What about the Scots-Irish when they arrive? First thing they build is a whiskey saloon. That's Tootsie's in Nashville. It's the most famous one I could find for you. And that's, again, we can find this heritage of living close to death, on the edge, rough and tumble, aggressive people, partying hard. Well, when you're partying, you got to have something that gets their party going. And that's why we have moonshine coming from the Appalachian Mountains and the South. Again, part of their culture. They'll actually go to war with George Washington early in America's history over the Whiskey Rebellion because they wanted to tax whiskey. And whiskey was even more important than just them partying. Whiskey was actually what was used to barter. It was basically their money. They're being taxed on their money. Now, they'll lose that one. But hey, it just tells you something about Scots-Irish. They're willing to fight anyone. English, Irish, American Indians, even their own country, especially when it's a fight over whiskey. Now, a lot of people moved into the Appalachian Mountains, the Germans, other cultures, but they didn't really adapt as well as the Scots-Irish. This is tough land, tough going. And the Scottish had farmland like this in Scotland and in Ireland, so they were better suited than the Germans. Not that the Germans weren't industrious and couldn't figure it out. They were just a little bit smarter and said, why are we even trying to figure it out? There's other places to go. Also, there's coal mining in the Appalachian Mountains, just as there have been in Scotland and Ireland. So once again, the jobs and land that no one wants always went to the Scots. And when they got to America, it's not necessarily a coincidence that they ended up in a place that suited them. They ended up in the place, once again, that no one else wanted. Working coal mines, working mountains, struggling. Hundreds of years of struggle. Maybe it gives you a little bit more understanding and empathy for today's hillbillies. Now, even then, it wasn't that good. Eventually, the 1900s roll in, and many of the Scots-Irish have had it. 500 years of struggle. Why keep doing this? Coal mines, an insufferable job, unbearable, the hardest of work. Eventually, they say, we're getting out of here. We're moving north to industry, to the cities, Cincinnati, Columbus, Cleveland, Detroit. We got to get out of here. We got to find some jobs. There's a better life. Just like the Scottish had left Ireland hundreds of years ago, the Scots-Irish exit the Appalachian Mountains and move to the Midwest for jobs in factories. The problem, they bring their bad habits with them. They bring their culture with them. The hillbilly, Scots-Irish behaviors follow. They're still fighting. It's just there's no wars anymore. They're still partying too hard. They are not welcomed by Ohio. Detroit wants nothing to do with them. And still today, we see a rift, a divide over the Scots-Irish or hillbillies not being accepted by most of the culture of Michiganders or Ohians. And also, by the way, when they came up there, they took jobs away from people who had been working in the factories in Ohio. They took jobs away from people working in Detroit. Does this sound familiar? Immigrants not being welcome because of their culture. Immigrants not being welcome because they're willing to work for lower wages. Yes, it's the same old immigration story. Yes, the Scots-Irish are hillbillies could be comparable to the Irish moving to America hundreds of years ago, or today to Hispanics moving, or the Asians from China and Japan on the West Coast during the 18th and 19th and 20th century. Same pattern as always that we see to today. We often forget about that because of the color of the hillbilly skin. They are white. And so we just tend to categorize people and mush them together and forget that this is an entirely different culture. And they are still struggling today. But they're often forgotten. Our lower income white men and white women, just because of the color of their skin, are often not given empathy, the benefit of the doubt, or not worried about, not treated, not helped out or subsidized by the government because of the color of the skin. Although their story is very similar to many others. And their story has actually taken a little tougher of a turn of late. Now, the road, the famous road that the hillbillies took as they exited the mountains and moved north to Columbus and to Detroit and Toledo was Route 23, US Route 23, the Hillbilly Highway, made famous by Dwight Yoakam with his song. We'll check it out in class, can't play it on the YouTube. Now you can see it, that red line's tough to see down here, but you can see it up there. This is the route that was supposed to lead to the promised land. Here we go. Once again, people moving from the south to the north to the promised land, expecting a new life, and it just does not work out that way. It's just as bad in Ohio and in Detroit as it was in the coal mine. They thought they would find new lives, but as you can see, there's still plenty of Americans struggling these days. And if you don't want to have any empathy, you could say, yes, the Scots-Irish, today's hillbillies, have only themselves to blame. They live too hard. Their culture of honor is not productive. They're always fighting, making poor choices. And unfortunately, that partying hard of whiskey, that has turned. And now today we have the heroin pipeline is Route 23, which is not too far from where I grew up. And the moonshine has been replaced by opioids and heroin. And again today, the Scots-Irish, their descendants, poor white Americans in many cases, and other Americans. The struggle continues. The fight for new opportunity, the fight for family, all of it still continues today, unfortunately. So when we go and try to understand in the complexities of the opioid epidemic, there are plenty of different parts to it. But one of the things that leans into the characteristics of addiction is the culture and the heritage of the Scots-Irish. Now, that's not the major factor into today's opioid epidemic, but it does help explain some of the users and some of the problems, especially in Ohio, where we've had a huge struggle, and in Southern Ohio with opioids. The culture of the people definitely made them more prone and more likely to get hit with these addictions, get hooked on painkillers. You also then factor in, well, who were the type of people who got stuck on painkillers? It was people with health pain, back pain, agonizing pain from years and years of working factory jobs, working low wages in very physical tasks. Whereas on the body, opioid is prescribed, opioid addiction takes over, heroin replaces the opioid. So the Scots-Irish culture of living hard didn't help. And then the fact that they moved into jobs that beat up the body also didn't help. And then you have the pharmaceutical companies on the side. We'll get to that one of these days. Scots-Irish, Hillbilly Elegy. We'll watch the film. Try to understand the culture, understand the president, what he has been, well, possible vice president. See what he's possibly been through. Maybe learn a thing or two about different cultures and beliefs in Ohio. You're going to see in this video, those people are from Ohio. Yes, those are the people from Ohio. Those are my people from Ohio, being a descendant myself of eastern Kentucky and the Appalachian Mountains.